Welcome all. I hope everyone who's here already is doing well. First off, thank you to everyone that's joined so promptly. I'm just going to give it a few moments just to let people get in before we really do get started. It's good to see more people joining. Just give it 10 or 15 more seconds and we'll get going. Okay, I think now's a good time for us to get cracking on this. To those of you I haven't already said hello to, thanks so much for joining us on what is the second of our Day in the Life of webinars that we're hosting as OneTrust partners. Today we're going to focus on data mapping and some of the key things to consider when starting a data mapping journey. I, for one, really am excited to share some of the insight that we've taken from our experience here, and we'll talk about it in more detail shortly, but to put it into context, we as the Data Privacy Group have worked with clients across 94 different countries to execute data mapping journeys. So before we get into it, I'd like to give you a short overview of who you'll be talking to on today's webinar. So without further ado, let me introduce you to myself. I'm Ian Borner, the Professional Services Director here at the Data Privacy Group. I lead our professional services and client delivery teams, and I myself have experience in delivering privacy compliance programs across multiple jurisdictions for large multinational organisations. I'm based here in the UK, just north of London, but I've got a diverse client base that crosses jurisdiction, geography, and market sector. Probably more interestingly, leading the technical conversation alongside me today is Luton Stonia. Luton heads up our medium to large company client delivery team and manages privacy offices for a number of our named clients. Luton's got a wealth of experience around data mapping and works across all of our client teams, implementing efficiencies and developing collective learning experiences to further develop our processes for clients. I should also say that we're really fortunate to have Luton on our team. Luton is among one of very few OneTrust fellows of privacy technology. That means essentially that Luton's passed all of the OneTrust expert accreditations, and he's got the privacy office management experience to go alongside his accreditation badges. You could say that his work has helped shape how we deliver privacy solutions for all of our clients. So, a little bit about the Data Privacy Group. As I said, we're headquartered in the UK, but we've got clients spanning across 94 different countries. As a OneTrust partner, we've enabled global FTSE and Fortune companies to untangle privacy regulations and manage their ongoing risks with transparency and trust. We address immediate privacy challenges, industry benchmarking, and operationalize data privacy programs for our clients. We've delivered privacy programs in 28 languages with a focus on the GDPR, CCPA, and LGPD. As I said at the beginning, we're a OneTrust partner and have built all of our solutions on top of the OneTrust platform. That's by design. This allows us to deliver the most powerful, all-encompassing privacy software to our clients and layer on specific workflows and management structures to drive maturity in our clients' privacy programs. Coupled with these, we work with globally recognized law firms to ensure that all of our workflows meet the requirements of different regulations across the globe. And we're also proud to be a member of the IAPP, and with that ensure that all of our employees are across the data privacy news and key events as they happen, And we're driving to have all of our employees accredited with IAPP certifications, so the CIPP, CIPM, CIPT, etc. So in terms of how we stack up as a company, we currently sit with about 44 clients, and that translates into 984 client companies. We manage 172 brands across those companies, and looking after the privacy matters of employees, about 35,000 employees across all of our clients. As I've said already, we operate in 94 different countries, have delivered privacy programs in 28 different languages. As we drill down and start focusing on data mapping, we've mapped over 1,500 assets. We're at almost 5,000 processes mapped. And then as we start looking at rights requests, we've built over 2,500 rights request workflows within OneTrust, close on 700 cookie preference centers. We've currently got about 22,000 users taking privacy training, and have built and implemented over 500 privacy notices. I'm pleased to say, and I hope this remains at zero, but we currently have zero regulatory enforcement actions across any of our clients. It's just a quick slide demonstrating Luton and some of the rest of the team's OneTrust credentials. So moving on, I'm going to pass you on to Luton, who is now going to walk us through his section of this presentation, and probably actually the reason you've all joined us, I'm sure. Luton has the aim of giving you a real insight into some of the things to consider when implementing a robust data mapping program within your organization, and how that translates into the OneTrust modules, data mapping, and assessment automation. So without further ado, I will pass over to you, Luton.
Thanks for that introduction, Ian. So, data mapping has become a complex and ever-changing aspect for businesses no matter where they are in the world. With so many privacy regulations being introduced, organisations are being held accountable for the personal data they hold now more than ever. This increase has meant that businesses who do not have the ability to effectively manage the personal data they hold will not be able to meet the requirements they fall under. So with that in mind, let me move on to the next slide, where I'll discuss the topics I'll be talking about. So to start, I'll be discussing the four main components that make up a data map. I will then move on to talk about the ROPA and documentation obligations organisations face around the world. I will then finish with explaining the benefits of carrying out a data mapping exercise for businesses just like yours. Once I've provided an overview of data mapping, I will show you an example of what a typical OneTrust data mapping environment looks like. Due to the complex nature of data mapping, I expect to receive some questions throughout this webinar. We will pick these questions up over the course of the session, and we'll have one of our technical team come back to you over the course of the next 48 hours with some answers to your questions. So let me now move on to discussing the four main components that are needed in order to create a successful data map. In order to create a structured data map, there are four components an organisation must identify and document, these being the personal data an organisation is responsible for, what processing activities are carried out, what assets are used to store and transfer the personal data, and finally, if any organisations other than your own have access to the personal data that your company is responsible for. Don't worry if you aren't familiar with some of these terms, as I will go through each component one by one and explain what they are and how they link to each other. So let me start with personal data. Personal data is any information that can be used to identify an individual. One of the simplest examples I use to explain what I mean by this is somebody's first name and last name. However, there are lots of different types, such as email address, phone number, and home address. There is also a personal data that can be classed as special category data. This is data that is classed as more sensitive, and therefore businesses must have extra measures in place to not only protect it, but to confirm the legal basis for holding it. A few examples of this would be ethnic origin, political opinions, or sexual orientation, but there are many more. So now that we understand kind of what personal data is, let me move on to show you how this links in with processing activities and ROPA. So for this, the GDPR describes processing activities as any operation or set of operations performed on personal data or sets of personal data. So with that in mind, let's explore what this means. A few examples of operations would be the collection, recording, storage, use, transmission, or the destruction on any information that would relate to an individual. So as you can see, a processing activity can be quite broad. A real world example of a processing activity would be the selling of a product to a customer, and in order to send the product to the customer's house, you would have to use the first name, last name, the address of the customer in order for that product to be sold and sent to them, and therefore a processing activity is taking place. Under the processing activities on the PowerPoint, we can see the acronym ROPA. This stands for Record of Processing Activities. Basically, ROPA is the documentation of certain types of information that relate to the processing activities that are carried out by your company. ROPA is a requirement for organisations that fall under the GDPR, but this is something I'll go into more detail in the next slide. In order for a data map to complete, a company would need to record every processing activity that they carry out. So now that we understand that personal data is information that identifies an individual, and a processing activity is any business process that performs an operation on that personal data, I'm going to move on and explain what assets are and how they kind of link with processing activities. So in terms of data privacy, an asset is classed as anything that is structured for data storage. So a paper stack sitting on someone's desk that has personal data involved wouldn't be classed as an asset as it's not structured. But a physical asset would be something like a filing cabinet or a data storage room, with a virtual asset being something such as like an ERP system or a cloud server such as Google Cloud, Dropbox or OneDrive, for example. So for each processing activity, it is likely that a number of assets are going to be used in order to store the personal data that is being processed. And within the data map, you would need to record what assets are being used for every process. So now that we understand that assets are used to store the personal data of individuals, I'll now move on to look at the data that is passed to your vendors and possibly other legal entities within your wider organisation. So there may be personal data that your organisation has collected but is actually processed by a vendor on your behalf. And within your data map, you would need to log the personal data that is being transferred externally. But before doing so, you should make sure that you have agreed the technical and organisational measures required by your vendors who will be in possession of the personal data processed on your behalf. A similar example could be used for legal entities that fall within your data mapping. For example, a breach of your organisation that is technically separated, that carries out a business process for you, would need to be documented within the data mapping in order to fully understand the transfer of data outside of your organisation. So now that I've explained kind of the four components that make up data mapping, I hope you understand just how vast of an undertaking it is for organisations to document all of this information. Without this, an organisation does not have the ability to make sure they're implementing sound data privacy practices, as they do not know where and how they collect the data, or when the personal data is being processed, and what happens once it's no longer needed. Another difficulty of data mapping is that it's a forever changing element, meaning that once an organisation completes it, they always have to continuously update and maintain the record to make sure the information documented is correct. Without this, information on processing activities that are no longer carried out or new bits of personal data that is collected will be missed, and therefore the data map will be incorrect. So with that, let me move on to discuss the ROPA and documentation obligations and how they change with organisations depending on where they operate in the world. So here we have a map of the world, and I've highlighted some of the main privacy regulations that either require organisations to maintain a record of processing activities, or if they only have to document certain types of information that can be related to data mapping. To start us off, let's talk about the two regulations that require ROPA. The first and main one being the General Data Protection Regulation. The GDPR has the strictest requirements when it comes to ROPA. These requirements are listed under Article 30, and companies that operate within the GDPR need to document several different types of information on all of the processing activities that they carry out. An example of information that would need to be documented would be the time limit for when the personal data is deleted and is no longer needed. However, there are many more. Companies that have more than 250 employees that fall under the GDPR must always keep a ROPA, and organisations with less than 250 employees are required to do so if the processing they carry out is likely to pose a risk to the rights and freedoms of the data subject, or if they process special category data, or if they process personal data regularly. This means that the majority of organisations in fact do need to conduct a ROPA exercise if they fall under the GDPR. This means that if your organisation is required to do a ROPA exercise and you haven't collected the information needed, significant fines are likely going to be imposed by the supervisory authority that you fall under. So with that in mind, let me move on to discuss another privacy regulations that requires companies to undergo a ROPA, in this case being the LGPD. The LGPD is the privacy regulation in Brazil, and it requires organisations that operate within the country to keep records of personal data processing operations carried out by them, especially when it's based on legitimate interests. The information required to be documented is listed in Article 37, however it's not as specific when it comes to what information is required to be recorded compared to Article 30 in the GDPR, and therefore the information required for Brazilian companies to document does not have to be as granular. If you're wanting to find out more about the exact requirements for companies that fall under the GDPR and LGPD, I highly recommend reading the two articles that I previously mentioned and that you can see at the bottom left of the PowerPoint here. With that, I'm going to move on to some of the other privacy regulations that do not specifically ask for ROPA, but would aid them in hitting other documentation requirements. So unlike the GDPR or LGPD, the CCPA, which stands for the California Consumer Privacy Act, does not explicitly require organisations to maintain a ROPA. However, the CCPA does require organisations to fully understand what data they collect and how they use it. Therefore, practically speaking, it is difficult to comply with the CCPA without conducting a ROPA type exercise. At the bottom you can see that I've also highlighted three other regulations. These three lay out similar kind of documentation requirements to the CCPA. The POPI lays out requirements for South African businesses, the PDPA focusing on companies in Thailand, and the Privacy Act in Australia. The businesses that fall under any of these privacy regulations are required to document in one form or another kind of how they collect, use and disclose personal information that they hold. This means that while technically speaking ROPA is not required, it will significantly help organisations in being able to record the information that is being required of them by the regulation that they fall under. With that, understanding which countries and which organisations would need to conduct a ROPA, or if they just need to document certain types of information, I'm going to move on to discuss kind of some of the benefits of completing a ROPA exercise for organisations. While organisations may be legally required to undergo a ROPA exercise and therefore complete data mapping, there are significant benefits that come along with completing one. Here are provided 4 examples of some of the benefits companies would get from data mapping. One of the main benefits is that it allows your organisation to view the entire scope of its data collection activities and all of the personal data it's responsible for in one single place. With this view, an organisation can identify the overlap between data processes, which in turn helps to minimise the personal data they collect and store in the first place. Another benefit of having an overview of where personal data is within an organization is the increased efficiency and effectiveness in handling data subject requests and data breaches. With organizations being on a time limit to handle a breach or a request, it is critical for organizations to have the ability to quickly and effectively gather the necessary information needed, or they may face significant fines. Data mapping provides organizations the ability to know exactly what assets are holding which personal data categories, meaning that the IT teams can quickly locate the personal data of the data subject for a request within the time limit. The same can be said for a data breach. For example, in the UK, the Supervisory Authority requires organisations to notify them within 72 hours of a breach occurring, and they must detail the categories of personal data and approximate number of individuals concerned in the breach. Within an organisation's data map, this information will have been documented, meaning the information you provide to the regulatory board will be accurate and easy to locate. Thirdly, with having to work with all employees within an organisation to identify and document all of the information required in a data map, it helps to create an organisation that understands how personal data is used or should be used. This helps companies to be more successful as it promotes all business departments to think the same way when it comes to data privacy and when they go about their various missions. And lastly, data mapping helps organisations to take informed risks. A clear and documented understanding of the personal data a company holds provides executives with the crucial information on the actual risks they may face. This allows organisations to make informed decisions on those risks they are willing to accept and those that they are not with the personal data that they hold. So now I've talked about some of the benefits companies will gain from completing a data mapping exercise, I'm going to move on to show you what a typical data map environment looks like on OneTrust. So here we have an example of a OneTrust data mapping dashboard. This would typically be used to gain a high-level overview of the information that has been documented for the purpose of data mapping. In this example here, we can see that there are 212 processing activities that operate on personal data. And next to this, we can see that there are 33 assets that have been documented. This overview also allows us to see where the assets are hosted in the world. Within this donut graph here, we can see these locations. So for example, here we can see that this company has documented that there are a total of 11 assets that are hosted in the United Kingdom. Now if I move on to the middle row, we can see that these stages in which the assessments are in. So assessments in OneTrust are basically used as questionnaires to gather information that is required by the privacy regulations in terms of data mapping. I'll go into more detail about the assessment shortly, but this overview just lets you kind of see what stages assessments are in. So in the bottom row here, this overview shows you how many assessments are currently open and how many are needing to be reviewed. So right now we can see that there are 2 assessments that need to be reviewed in order for them to be moved into the completed stage. So now that you kind of get an idea of what type of information is on a data mapping dashboard, I will move on to look into the data mapping components that I've discussed earlier on in this webinar to kind of show you what kind of information is documented. So first of all, I'm going to talk about assets. So here we have the list of assets that have been documented. At the bottom here, we can see that there are 33 assets in total. We're also able to see certain types of information in this overview, such as the hosting locations, what type the asset is, and the owner for each of the assets. So let's have a look into an example of some of the information that can be gathered for each asset. So here we have a view of what a typical details tab would look like for an asset. So the asset we're looking at is Dynamics 365 Sales, and this is a customer relationship management software. Within the details tab, we're able to manually input information for this asset. So I know that this asset stores, right here we click that, I know that this asset stores 10,000 to 100,000 data subjects' personal data. So I could select this here and save at the bottom right, and this would automatically update the asset for the information that you've inputted. So we also have a description of the asset, the reason why we use it. The security measures are in place to protect the personal data stored in the asset. and there's lots of different types here. This information can also be inputted through assessments. So as I've mentioned already, an assessment is basically a questionnaire, and we would send this questionnaire to the IT owner for this asset, asking for all this information. So it would ask what's the hosting type of this asset, where is it located, and once the IT owner has responded to that assessment and completed it, we would review that assessment, and once it's been reviewed, the information would be automatically pulled into this details tab here. So you wouldn't have to manually input it, but you can if you want to. On the right here, we also have the related processing activities tab. This shows us all of the processing activities that use this as asset, in this case it being Dynamics 365, to either store, transfer, or process the personal data involved in this processing activity. So with this being a Dynamics 365 sales, is it being a customer relationship management software asset, it's likely that these processing activities are going to be sales orientated, which we can see here with these three processing activities. There's also lots of other things you can have a look at. You can look at risks for assets, so the risks involved with the personal data that's stored, documents that are involved, and we can see here, which I've already talked about, the three related processing activities. We can see other related assets to the asset. This asset doesn't actually have this information. Or we could also see the related vendors and related data elements. So with that, I'm going to move on to discuss kind of information that will be collected for processing activities. So let's have a look now. So here we have the list of processing activities. Like we had the view of assets, we can see the total number of processing activities in the bottom here. Something that I actually forgot to mention for the assets is that you are able to design and get a high-level overview of certain types of information from the top level here. So if I decided I wanted to see the data subject volume for all of the processing activities, well, that actually happened to select one, I could just move that across here and I applied that. And so we can see the volume of data subjects for each processing activity. So let's have a better look at a processing activity example, in this case it being accept and validate sales orders. So here we are given a very similar view to what the asset details tab looked like. However, there's different types of information that's been gathered for processing activities compared to the assets. So what I've mentioned in this webinar earlier, we need to know certain types of information for each processing activity if a company is operating within the GDPR. And this bit of information is stipulated under Article 30. And for example, we can see here that we know that the purpose of processing for this processing activity is for finance, and we also have the legal basis for processing. So for this processing activity, the personal data has been provided through the consent of the individual giving the personal data to this organization. We also see the region in which the data subjects are located, how many data subjects have their personal data used in this accepting and validating sales orders. So this is a very similar view to what we've already seen with the assets. On the right here, we are given the related assets. So for this processing activity, 7 assets are used to store, transfer, or process the personal data used in this processing activity. So we can see here, with it being a sales processing activity, they're using Salesforce and the Dynamics 365 sales asset that we've already looked at previously. So we also have the assessments and risks and many more tabs at the top here if you're wanting to do different things with this processing activity. So with that, let me move on to show you an example of one of the vendors. So here we have the list of vendors. At the bottom here, we can see that there are 27 that have been documented, and we are given lots of different types of information for each vendor. So let's have a quick look at some of the examples of information that can be collected for a vendor. Let's choose this one. So we have information on Canva for this vendor, and we have supporting documentation. There's lots of information here that's missing. This can be normal in OneTrust, but obviously the aim is to gather as much information as possible for all vendors. So we can see, scroll down here, we have workforce personnel. Do they have an onboarding process? Do they have a safe work environment policy? Do they have other things such as authorized access? So we can kind of see just how much effort they're putting into protecting the personal data that this organization has provided to them in order for them to carry out a service. So let me move on just to show you what the assessments look like, these questionnaires that we use to gather information. So within this assessment tab, we're able to see all of the assessments that have been sent out to a respondent. So let's have a quick look at a processing activity assessment that is used to gather the information on all processing activities. So we're greeted with a welcome message. This kind just gives information on why we are sending out these assessments to the respondent and explain that there are 5 sections and how to move forward for each section. So either by pressing the arrow at the bottom right here, you can go on to the next section, or you can press the buttons here on the left. So we can see that the processing activity name, just for this example for the webinar, I've created one previously just called processing activity, but it would ask questions such as, provide a description for this activity, the purposes for this processing activity. So if it was a sales business process, you would select sales here. So if we scroll down, there's lots of different types of questions that are being answered. And this would, once it's been completed and reviewed, this would automatically pull through the information into the details tab for the processing activity that we're questioning. So each section here, with there being 5, is asking questions on either the processing details, what personal data is being used in that processing activity, is there any special category data involved in this business process, what assets are being used to collect and process and transfer the personal data. And at the end, it's asking questions such as, is your organization the controller for this processing activity, or is it the joint controller, or is it just acting as a processor on behalf of the controller? And once this assessment has been filled out by the respondent, they're able to submit the assessment, and this would mean that the assessment would now be in the review stage. And once it's been reviewed, it would be moved into the completed stage. So with that, let me move on to show you what an asset map would look like. So this is an asset map. This is used to gain a view of just where all of the assets are located in the world. If you're wanting to see a specific list for all the assets in one country, you can select the number. So in the United States, we're able to see that there are 9 in total at the bottom here, and we're able to see the specific assets hosted in each country. So let me move on to show you the cross-border map. The cross-border map is used to see where personal data is being transferred from one country to another. So if we click on one of these lines here, we can see that there are currently 3 processing activities that transfer personal data from one country to another. In this case, it being personal data that's collected in the United States and it's transferred and stored in an asset hosted in the United Kingdom. So we're able to see different ones. So for accepting and validating sales orders, there's an asset in Colombia that stores personal data that is used for this processing activity, and it's transferred to the United Kingdom. And finally, let me move on to show you what a data lineage looks like. A data lineage is used to see the life cycle in which personal data takes inside a processing activity. So let's have a look at the processing activity that is accepting and validating sales orders. So we can see for this activity here that personal data is collected on a customer, and it's sourced and collected by using the asset Salesforce. So once the personal data for this processing activity has been collected, it's stored using Salesforce and SharePoint. And then once it's been processed, you're able to access the information using the asset of Dynamics 365, the asset that we looked at earlier. And then once the personal data is no longer needed, the data is deleted. So with that, I've shown you everything I wanted to show today in this OneTrust demonstration. I've just provided you a high-level overview of all things that you can do in data mapping. There's lots of other complex and very granular things that you can also do. But I'd like to say thank you for listening to everything I've had to say today and staying till the end. I'm going to hand this back to Ian, and he's just going to quickly mention what we're doing with all the questions that we've received today.
Well, what can I say? Thank you so much for that, Luton. I can see that a lot of effort's gone into that presentation and demo, and I really do hope that the information that you've passed on today has been useful for the audience. Now, with regard to questions around data mapping, we quite often find that these questions can become quite involved. So with that in mind, I'd request that you use the question submitter, and we've got members of Luton's team ready to pick them up, and we'll follow up with questions individually over the course of the next 48 hours. So a final thank you from me to everyone that has joined us today, and I hope you're able to take something away from this. If you want to reach out to either Luton or I, please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn or follow any of our company pages across any of the major social platforms. Just search for the Data Privacy Group. Thanks, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.